So, have you ever felt that little flicker of annoyance, maybe?
What's that?
When you see, one political side just absolutely tearing into the other side
Yeah.
for something that makes you pause and think, hang on, haven't I seen your guys do something, well, pretty similar?
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
That feeling that maybe there's a bit of a double standard going on, it can be really frustrating, right?
Yeah.
Trying to follow the arguments.
Exactly. Well, today we're doing a deep dive into a piece that tackles this head on and pretty forcefully.
Okay.
We're going to unpack Larken Rose's article, Shut the Hell Up, You Hypocritical Democrats and Republicans.
Wow, okay. Doesn't mince words, does he?
Not at all. The
Okay.
title alone tells you this isn't aiming for polite academic discussion.
Oh, no. Sounds deliberately provocative. Designed to shake things up a bit, maybe challenge some assumptions.
That's the idea. And our goal here isn't to, agree or disagree necessarily,
Hey.
but to really get into his perspective, understand the core of what he's arguing about, this hypocritical moral outrage he sees everywhere in politics.
So we're focusing just on this one article today.
Yeah, this single, very strongly worded piece, it offers a, let's say, sharp perspective on American politics.
Got it. And it's important to remember, we're exploring his claims, the arguments he makes in the article.
Absolutely. We're just presenting his viewpoint. And fair warning, there are some pretty strong ideas coming up.
Like what?
Well, he makes this comparison. Democrats criticizing Trump are like Nazis being condemned by communists.
Whoa, okay. That's
Right.
definitely an attention grabber.
Right. And then there's this analogy about voting being like choosing your preferred slave master.
Yikes. So, yeah, definitely provocative.
It is. So let's get ready. This should give us plenty to think about. Okay, let's just jump in. What's the absolute core argument? What's he really hammering home here?
Well, fundamentally, as that title suggests, his main point is that both major parties, Democrats and Republicans, are deeply involved in what he calls hypocritical moral outrage.
Okay.
And he's not just talking about, the occasional slip-up or inconsistency.
Right.
He argues it's something much more fundamental, sort of baked into the system. Both sides, he says, get outraged about authoritarian stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But mainly when the other side is doing it. When it's their own side, their own leaders, well, the reaction is very different, either quiet or justified or just ignored.
So it's less about isolated incidents and more about like a pattern, applying different rules depending on whose team it is.
Exactly. That's the crux of it. For Rose, this selective outrage shows a lack of real commitment to principles like liberty or justice.
Okay.
Instead, he sees it as basically partisan loyalty taking precedence over any kind of ethical consistency.
And he talks about something called universal authoritarianism. That sounds big. What do you mean by that specifically?
Yeah, it's a key part of his setup. He suggests that many of the things Democrats were really critical of during the Trump years.
Right. Things labeled authoritarian.
Exactly. Things like certain immigration policies, maybe ignoring due process, executive orders. Rose argues these weren't unique to Trump.
Okay.
He claims you can find similar actions, maybe framed differently or to different degrees, under Obama, Bush, Clinton, and now Biden too.
So his point is that the exercise of executive power often looks kind of similar, regardless of the party label.
That's a big piece of it, yes. And that's where that really stark comparison comes in.
The Nazis and communists one.
Right. Democrats criticizing Trump are like Nazis being condemned by communists. Now, it's crucial to understand his likely intent there.
Okay, yeah.
He's probably not saying the parties are Nazis or communists ideologically. It's more about the dynamic of hypocrisy.
So it's like saying both groups in the analogy, and by extension, the Democrats and Republicans are capable of oppressive actions, just maybe different kinds.
Exactly. Different targets, different methods maybe. But because both have their own track records, according to him, when one side loudly condemns the other for similar behavior, it just doesn't ring true. It lacks moral authority, in his view.
That's a really powerful way to frame it, designed to make you stop and think, even if you push back on the comparison itself. Now, he doesn't just leave it there, does he? He gives specific examples of this selective moralism.
Oh, yeah. He provides several examples to back this up.
Like what?
Well, he points to the relative lack of sustained outrage from many Democrats over President Obama authorizing drone strikes, including against U.S. citizens abroad, without trial. That was a big civil liberties debate back then.
I remember that, yeah.
Then, conversely, he points to Republicans who attack Democrats for tax and spend policies.
A classic line.
Right. But, he argues, they often ignored very similar fiscal approaches when Trump was in office. increased spending, deficits.
Ah, so it's that tendency to kind of grade on a curve. Your side gets a pass, the other side gets slammed for the same thing.
That's precisely his point. He argues both sides tend to justify or downplay government overreach or even violence, as long as it serves their agenda or party.
Okay.
And he has that quote in the article that just boils it down. He says, "You are the Republicans, you are the Democrats, you are the same."
Wow.
For him, despite all the noise and the fighting, they're operating within the same basic status system and end up acting in similar ways when it comes to state power.
Which brings us to his critique of the whole two-party system. He calls it a false dichotomy. What's behind that?
He sees the choice between Democrat and Republican as, well, an illusion of meaningful choice.
How so?
He believes politicians basically play voters, getting them to support policies he sees as oppressive just by making it about us versus them, your team versus their team.
Right.
So voters get caught up in winning the election for their side rather than holding anyone in power accountable to consistent principles.
And that leads to that really uncomfortable analogy he uses.
Yeah, the one about voting being like choosing your preferred slave master on a political plantation.
That's pretty harsh.
It's extremely harsh. It's a very strong libertarian critique, really.
Mm-hmm.
The idea is that in a system where the state holds coercive power, even voting doesn't equal real freedom. You're just picking who gets to wield that power over you for the next few years. It shows a deep, deep skepticism about whether electoral politics as it exists can actually deliver liberty.
Okay, so if that's his diagnosis of the problem, this bipartisan hypocrisy, this flawed system, what's the alternative he proposes? That's where voluntarism comes in.
Correct. He positions voluntarism as the fundamental opposite of what he calls statism.
And what is voluntarism in his terms?
At its core, it's about individual sovereignty you own yourself. It's based on the non-aggression principle,
Meaning
you don't initiate force or fraud against others. All interactions should be voluntary, based on mutual consent. No coercion, no theft, no violence initiated by one person against another.
So things the government normally does.
Yeah.
How would they happen?
Well, in this view, things like security, roads, dispute resolution, they'd be handled through voluntary means. Private companies, charities, community associations, market solutions, things people choose to participate in.
And statism then is the problem because...
Because, in Rose's view, government fundamentally relies on coercion. Think about it. Taxes taking money without explicit individual consent, he'd argue. Laws enforced by the threat of fines, imprisonment, ultimately violence. The state claims a monopoly on using force in its territory.
Okay.
So for him, it leads to this very stark conclusion. If you advocate for government, you're advocating for violent subjugation. That's a cornerstone of his voluntarist perspective.
He then loops back to some historical examples, viewing them through this voluntarist lens. He argues different presidents have consistently committed what he'd call atrocities against liberty. Remind us of those examples again.
Sure. He goes back through them. Obama and the drone strikes, Clinton and the Waco siege under Janet Reno, Bush, torture and wars he sees as aggressive.
Yeah.
Then more recently, Trump's tax policies, which he frames as wealth redistribution, and Biden continuing things like military spending or using executive orders.
And the key link he makes isn't just the actions themselves, but the reaction or the lack of it from party loyalists.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's the recurring theme. People strongly identified with, say, the Democrats might have been quiet or defensive about the drone strikes. People identified with Republicans might defend actions under Bush or Trump. For Rose, this is Exhibit A of the hypocrisy. The outrage is turned on and off depending on who's wearing which jersey.
So all this builds up to a direct challenge he throws down to the reader, to anyone engaging with his ideas. What's that challenge?
It's pretty direct. He basically says, stop identifying primarily as a Democrat or a Republican.
You just stop.
Yeah. Reject the double standards completely. Don't have one set of rules for your guy and another for the opposition. His challenge is to commit to a consistent morality, a set of principles that you apply equally to everyone, regardless of party. If you genuinely care about justice, he argues, that has to come before party loyalty.
And he puts that quite bluntly, too, right?
Extremely bluntly. He says, if you actually believe in justice, you wouldn't say, my guy. You'd say, I want no part in this.
Wow. That really draws a line.
It does. It demands a kind of principled detachment from the partisan fray.
So where does he land? What's the ultimate conclusion, the call to action after all this quite intense analysis?
He concludes by championing voluntarism. That's the ethical path forward, in his view, as opposed to government.
So reject government entirely.
Essentially, yes, because he sees it as inherently coercive. He encourages people to look into voluntarist ideas, read the literature. He even recommends his own book, The Most Dangerous Superstition, for those who want to explore it more deeply.
And his final parting shot, I imagine it's pretty strong.
Oh, it is. Very uncompromising. He basically says, if your loyalty lies with politics, you're an enemy of humanity. If it lies with truth, justice, and individual freedom, you must reject both parties and the system itself.
Okay, well, that definitely leaves you with something to think about. So wrapping up this deep dive into Larken Rose's article, the core takeaway is really this accusation of deep-seated bipartisan hypocrisy.
Right. And his call to abandon those political labels in favor of a consistent ethical framework, which for him is voluntarism.
The key insight he's pushing isn't about specific policies being right or wrong.
No, it's more about how we judge them.
Right.
Are we applying the same moral yardstick to everyone?
Exactly. Rose is really pushing you listening, to ask, are we truly holding everyone to the same standard? Or is our loyalty to Team Blue or Team Red making us turn a blind eye sometimes? Is it blinding us to things we'd condemn if the other side did them?
It really forces you to consider what a truly principled stance looks like. Is it even possible to stay consistent in today's political climate without falling into those traps of bias and selective anger?
And maybe that leads to our final thought for you to mull over. What if we spent less energy on the political horse race, the day-to-day battles, and more energy on clarifying our own fundamental principles? Could focusing on consistency offer a different way to look at societal problems and maybe our own role in them?
It's definitely something to reflect on. Where do your own loyalties really lie? With a party? Or with a set of principles you hold regardless of who's in power? A challenging question to end on.